Jujutsu Kaisen is a series that I hold near and dear to my heart. I have so many fond memories of reading and watching it, which is why it sucks that it ended the way that it did. Let me tell you, I have a lot of thoughts about the series, so I figured now that it's over, why not do a good old-fashioned retrospective, reviewing and reflecting on the series as a whole. If you've ever wanted my opinion on a specific moment or arc, this is probably the place to find it. So without further ado, let's get into it. I'm going to focus on the anime adaptation more so than the manga, because I believe that this is one of the few anime adaptations that truly improves upon the manga in every single way. It was this season that made me fall in love with Jujutsu Kaisen because every single aspect just felt so well done, such as the characters, which were varied, interesting, and had unique interactions. Sure, they were a bit one-dimensional, but it was only the first 24 episodes, so surely they had plenty of time to develop in the manga. My favorites right off the bat were Inumaki and Nobara, but Todo, Megumi, and Gojo were always a pleasure to see on screen too. The antagonist group was also great, not too serious, but obviously strong and had a great reason for opposing the protagonists. I love when villains have purpose rather than just being evil because they hate the world or just to be evil. And I think the idea behind the disaster curses believing they are the true humans is so fascinating. I was enjoying this series from the very first episode, but the episode that truly got me hooked was episode 7, Assault, which I'm sure hooked plenty of you as well. Watching Gojo open his domain and melt Jogo's mind was so cool. And what's crazy is it wasn't even in the manga. The sequence was there in general, but it was only like 2 pages. A lot of the visual aid of Infinite Void just wasn't there. This is what I mean when I say the anime truly improves on the source material. There are so many scenes in season 1 like this that just purely enhance on the reading experience in every way. And while season 2 does do its fair bit of embellishing too, I wasn't a huge fan of it, and we'll get to why when we talk about Shibuya. There were 4 main arcs in season 1. The introduction arc, the versus Mihito arc, the Tokyo Goodwill event, and the Death's Paintings arc. All 4 of the arcs are good, but what I think makes them interesting is that they all bring a different tone while still staying consistent to the main themes of early Jujutsu Kaisen. Personally, the versus Mihito arc was undoubtedly my favorite arc in season 1. The introduction of Mihito as a main antagonist was so well done, and I think it was this arc that set the tone for the overall story through Shibuya. This wasn't going to be some happy-go-lucky shonen where no one dies and the suffering is only superficial. It's going to be dark and depressing in the best way possible. And what really reinforced this was the music. The music of season 1 was phenomenal in general, but this arc really pushed it to the next level, with pieces like Working Overtime and Self-Embodiment of Perfection being introduced. I wish I could play some for you, but I can't. Thanks, copyright. I think part of what made season 1 so special for me from a music point of view was that every single piece felt like it was made for the scenes it was used in. Like every time you hear Megumi's theme, it makes sense. Every time you hear Boogie Woogie, it makes sense. And this isn't something that's done super often in anime. Usually anime soundtracks, while often good, are not tailored to fit specific moments like this, and I think it shows a high level of collaboration between the animation team and the soundtracking team. The soundtrack popped so hard this season, which is super important for the enjoyment of a series like Jujutsu Kaisen because so much time is spent just watching the fighting. There's not a ton of dialogue to fill the space, which means all you're experiencing orally is sound effects and music. It's a super important aspect of Jujutsu Kaisen that I think is often overlooked, so I just wanted to mention it. I was also really fond of the Kyoto Goodwill event. There was so much meaning to so many of the fights, and I think it was the perfect way to add some substance to an otherwise low-stakes arc. The fight between Mechamaru and Panda being between 2 fake humanoid beings, Nobara and Momo fighting about women and making everyone believe Gege would be good at writing women, and of course, Maki and Mai showing their opposing beliefs despite being twins. It was really well done in my opinion, and the fight against Hanami was also great, introducing even more great music and my favorite animated sequence from season 1. Overall, season 1 set a really hard bar to clear for the rest of Jujutsu Kaisen in both the anime and the manga. Does season 2 meet that mark? Well, yeah, which is why it's brought to you by Jujutsu Kaisen Phantom Parade, the first official mobile game of Jujutsu Kaisen. Jujutsu Kaisen Phantom Parade is launching later this year, and if you're bummed out about the manga ending, you need to pre-register for it, as the game is an immersive and authentic adaptation of Jujutsu Kaisen. It meticulously recreates the abilities from the show, allowing you to experience the intensity from the original series right in the game. Abilities like the Ten Shadows technique and Straw Doll technique are available for you to use, and you can even invite your friends to form your own Phantom Parade team, collaborating just like the students do in Jujutsu Kaisen. Kaisen. The more friends you invite, the more rewards you receive. You just have to send an invite code to them, and when they register, you can win up to 1100 cubes. Players who pre-register will also receive a redrawable SSR character guaranteed gacha ticket, along with cubes worth 25 draws. So what are you waiting for? Pre-register now via the link in the description or the pinned comment. Potentially hot take incoming. I did not like Jujutsu Kaisen Season 2 as much as I liked Jujutsu Kaisen Season 1. Controversial, I know, but hear me out. I still think Season 2 is great, but for very different reasons than Season 1. But before we get into Season 2, I should mention I did read the manga for Hidden Inventories and the Shibuya incident before Season 2 aired, so my method of consuming the media was inherently different from Season 1. This definitely did affect my interpretation of the show, but I don't think it's the reason I think Season 2 is not quite as good as Season 1. Season 2 is what most people would consider the golden age of Jujutsu Kaisen, and I tend to agree. It is when the manga was at its absolute peak. Both Hidden Inventories and the Shibuya incident are great arcs individually, and they work really well together as a season. Hidden Inventories was a very enjoyable arc all the way through. Getting Gojo's backstory, watching his rise to the top, and Geto's descent was so good. There was so much symbolism and philosophical depth in this arc. What does it mean to be a Jujutsu sorcerer? What is the long-term solution to cursed spirits? How are sorcerers supposed to cope with the actions they're forced to take? The new characters introduced in this arc were also amazing, even though the only new major characters were Toji and Rika. Both were great. I mean, Toji was so good, Gege just had to make another. Hidden Inventories also had some of the best pacing of the entire series. It didn't feel like it was moving too fast or dragging on. It was just a nice, succinct arc that aided in the setup of the Shibuya incident, which I believe is one of the best arcs of the new generation of anime, like top 3 with the International Assassins arc and Control Devil arc from Chainsaw Man. Shibuya is a war done right. The concept and construction of the arc from its foundation is great. It's obviously an arc that Gege put a lot of thought into and a lot of work into as well. It's truly amazing in every way and has pretty much no flaws in the manga. Yeah, this is probably my blazing hot take for the video. I wasn't a huge fan of the anime adaptation of the Shibuya incident. Don't get me wrong, it's not bad. It's obvious that a lot of work went into this project from everyone at MAPPA, but in my opinion, an anime adaptation exists to elevate the source material, and I just think that the manga is better than the anime for Shibuya. It was still good, but I did have a few issues with the adaptation. My biggest issue with the adaptation is the soundtrack. It's just a big downgrade from Season 1. As I already mentioned, in Season 1, there were soundtracks that felt like they were custom written for specific moments, whereas the soundtrack for Season 2 feels like it was a bit of an afterthought. Sure, there was a good amount of bangers like the Sukuna Suite and Physical Prowess, but you also have pieces like Locust Plague that are shoehorned into like 5 different moments. Like, what does Mahoraga have to do with this piece? This didn't really happen in Season 1, so I was a little bit disappointed to hear so much of the same songs reused over and over again. Another issue I had, which I mentioned earlier, was the way they embellished fights in Season 2. In Season 1, a lot of the embellishments serve purely to improve upon the source material, like Gojo's domain expansion, or adding to this sequence in order to showcase the collaboration from the first years. But the embellishments of Season 2 just felt like they strayed too far from the source material. Like, there was a lot of stuff that happened that had no bearing to the manga at all. A lot of the Toji Dagon fight was completely made up. Mahoraga never threw a train at Sukuna or did this weird color-changing thing. Jogo never picked up buildings with lava. It felt like their approach to embellishing in Season 2 was go for as much flash as possible, while completely disregarding the rules and scaling set up in the manga along the way, and I just wasn't a huge fan of that. I think there's definitely an extent to where embellishment is fine. I just think the embellishment in Season 2 went way too far. And my final major issue was just the inconsistent quality. I know that production was rough for this season, but that's not really an excuse in my eyes. If you're producing the most popular anime on the planet, you shouldn't have production or crunch time issues. You should be able to plan and use your resources so you can produce the best anime possible. This was Jujutsu Kaisen Season 2. It should not have had any issues, period. They could have taken 3 more months to produce this series and made it look better all the way through, and I promise no one would have complained. But instead, we got a rushed season with inconsistent animation and a slew of animators that will never work on this project again because they refuse to work in the same conditions, which is completely justified. It just shouldn't happen in the first place. Regardless of these issues, the Shibuya incident is still a great arc in pretty much every way. The manga was just a bit more enjoyable for me. But from here, cracks start to form. With the introduction of the Culling Games and concepts like the back of the prison realm, I think this is where the story starts its long and slow decline. Sure, there is perfect preparation, which is pretty solid, but I don't think what surrounds it is all that amazing. And I don't mean that I was upset that it wasn't some high energy craziness. I understand that this is very much a setup arc, but even as setup arcs go, I don't think it was super well executed. To me, this is where it felt like Gege started to make things up along as he went. One example of this is the aforementioned back of the prison realm. At the time, the back of the prison realm seemed kind of innocuous, but looking at it now, it doesn't really make a ton of sense. You're really telling me that the prison realm, a well-known cursed object that was the key to Kenjaku's plan, just happened to have a flaw that he didn't know about? The dude who planned the Culling Games for 1,000 years never once heard of the back of the prison realm, not a single time until after he took over Tengen? Really? It just seems like the kind of oversight Kenny wouldn't make, and it's really just an exemplification of the small issues that start to appear in Gege's writing post-Shibuya. Another issue is the general construction of the Culling Games. It was recently revealed in an interview that the Culling Games was originally supposed to be a tournament arc, and I really wish that is what we had gotten instead of what we did. While I don't think the Culling Games that we got was outright bad, it was definitely annoying to read, and especially read weekly. The 4 colonies took over a year total, and it felt like such a slog of an arc. It was over 40 chapters just to make a smidge of progress in the story, which was not great feeling as a reader. I don't think this was completely an issue with the arc itself, more so how it was arranged. If we spent more time switching between perspectives rather than just 8 chapters in each colony, I think that would have worked fine, as the contents of each colony is not terrible. A lot of the fights are pretty solid. Sendai was great, Hikari and Kashimo was amazing, even Yuji versus Higuruma was pretty good too. Really, none of the battles individually were that bad. It was more that the pacing just felt so slow, especially compared to the rest of Jujutsu Kaisen. And just so we're clear, I don't have an issue with slow-paced arcs. One of my favorite arcs of all time is the Succession War from Hunter x Hunter, which is already almost 60 chapters long and still feels like it's ramping up. The difference is every chapter in that arc feels packed with progress. Like there are individual pages in that arc that make more progress than entire chapters in the Culling Games. And this leads to the arc being not that enjoyable of a read chapter over chapter. And going back to reread it now as a binge, it kind of still feels the same, so it wasn't a weekly release issue. It just felt like an underwhelming arc that kind of meandered its way, but it wasn't that bad. At least, not compared to what's to come. Like the Yuki and Kenjaku fight. Okay, the fight itself wasn't that bad, but it did have some pretty uncharacteristic moments from a compositional standpoint, like Kenjaku slipping this piercing blood, because really, what was that? This dude took it point blank like it was truly nothing. How did his string survive? But the bigger issue, of course, is the death of Yuki Tsukumo. Yuki was a character that I and many others felt was being built up to be important to the latter parts of Jujutsu Kaisen. Her direct opposing ideology to Kenjaku felt like it would play a role in ending cursed spirits forever. She was a character that was subtly hyped up every time she was introduced or mentioned, being the first special grade, a plasma star vessel, and the woman who trained Todo. There was so much hype surrounding her just for her to die in 3 chapters. To this day, it is without a doubt one of my biggest issues with the series, and her after death isn't much better, as she's reduced to a book about souls, which does absolutely nothing, because it's later revealed that Yuji's ability to strike the soul comes not from this book, but from fighting Mahito while having Sukuna in his body. So in reality, she was literally a pointless character hyped up to be written out of the story for some reason. It's a decision that truly baffles me. Something must have changed in the production plans post Shibuya, but I digress. To be honest, the treatment and underdevelopment of a lot of side characters is one of the things about Jujutsu Kaisen that annoys me the most. So many unique and interesting characters are introduced for one fight and then never seen again, or sometimes even just one chapter and we kind of have to accept that we'll never actually see them again or know anything about them at all. There are even major characters like Kenjaku who have relatively large times devoted to them with still tons of unanswered questions, and I just don't understand why. Like, it's so obvious that Gege has more of this world planned in his head or in the background, so why not just show us? Just give us some more to chew on. Everyone anyone wants a Heian era flashback or just more information on Kenjaku and Sukuna, or Kenjaku and Tengen's relationship, or Kenjaku and Yuji's relationship, but we never get it, and it makes no sense to me as to why that is. It just baffles me and honestly frustrates me as well. Another moment that baffles me from a writing perspective is the Megumi moment, or rather, something that happens within this moment. Megumi is touted as being among the smartest of the Jujutsu students, being the smartest in Tokyo period, and yet, despite this, he never once considered that Sumiki could have been overwritten, not a single time, not even once. It just feels very out of character for him, but maybe I'm misunderstanding his character. We'll be talking about Megumi again in the ending section, so for now, let's move on to the Gojo and Sukuna fight. This was, without a doubt, one of the most hyped up fights in the 21st century, if not in the entire history of anime, and I gotta say, it was one of my favorite times to be a Jujutsu Kaisen fan. Every week was so enjoyable reading the manga and seeing the fandom go insane. From agendas to Lobotomy Kaisen, it was just so entertaining and really made this fight even more enjoyable than it already was. But rereading the fight now and looking back on it, I don't think it was actually as good as it seemed when it released. At least for the first half. The Clash of Domains got kind of repetitive, and there were a couple of chapters where there was more peanut gallery than actual fighting. But once the Battle of Domains was over and it was just a hand-to-hand, balls-to-the-wall brawl, it was peak. I loved the second half of this fight so much, and it really felt like a return to form for Gege, and I kinda wish it's just what we got the whole time, but I know it wouldn't have made sense in the conventions of Jujutsu to do this kind of fight until both of their domains were gone. Really, my complaints about the Gojo versus Sukuna fight are overall pretty minor, right up until we get to its conclusion. Gojo's death was poorly executed, we'll say. I think part of the issue was just the whiplash of going from Gojo 1 to Gojo's dead. It wasn't exactly a great feeling for anyone reading. It felt like Gege lied directly to the reader, and about one of the most important moments in the show, no less. There was no indication of Gojo's death until we saw his dead body. It just feels so wrong to kill any character in this way, let alone Gojo. And the fact he spent his last minutes talking about how strong Sukuna was just felt so out of character. This is the dude that put everything on the line for his students, and he didn't mention them in any meaningful way. It seemed he had almost no remorse about losing, and that just doesn't feel like Gojo. And to be clear, I don't mind that Gojo died. His death flags were flying for a long time, so it was somewhat expected. But if you're going to kill off one of the most popular anime characters of all time, you gotta do it with care and make sure it accurately reflects the character. Don't make him glaze his opponent and leave some ambiguous message about North and South that led to a whole year of coping for Gojo fans. Did they not suffer enough when he was stuck in that tiny little box? Now you're turning them into actual conspiracy theorists. Unfortunately, I think this was also the time when the quality of the series started to seriously lack. Maybe it wasn't the best during the Culling Games, but there were still hints at good plots and good ideas. But the fight between Jujutsu Society and Sukuna, I cannot call it good, except for a very few select moments. I think the issue with the fight against Sukuna is, ironically enough, the same issue as the Culling Games. It has pacing issues. Somehow, it felt like this fight dragged on for so long, but at the same time, it didn't feel long enough. Like, if we include the battle against Gojo, this fight lasted for over a year, but it also felt rushed, especially towards the end. Introducing the Yuta Gojo twist for 1.2 chapters, bringing back Todo with a new technique just to break it in 3 chapters, giving Yuji a domain out of nowhere for literally 2 chapters, the hasty return of Nobara. It felt like a lot of the time Gege was taking to develop this fight in the first half of the fight just kind of disappeared. Now, I don't think this is outright a bad thing, as the Sukuna cycle was getting quite tired, but it led to the end of the fight against Sukuna feeling just a bit anticlimactic. It just sort of ended. Megumi decided he was done with Sukuna, and so that's it. It didn't feel like there's really a last push or last effort or last hurrah like there often is in a finale fight. It just abruptly ended, and it felt like there was still a lot more to go. A lot of the fights Gege writes, the ending feels satisfying. That's part of what makes them so good and fun to read. So for the most important fight in the series to end the way it did, I don't know, it just left me feeling a bit unsatisfied. To put it in the words of Ryu, I just wasn't left full. And for the rest of the fight, there's just not a lot of positives that I can point out if I'm being honest. There were some individual chapters that were good, like chapter 250 and chapter 257, but for the most part, it was just full of cheap shock value. And at times, it felt like Gege was just making stuff up as he went without any full vision for the fight. Take, for example, Sukuna's Maelstrom of Binding Vows. It felt like Gege needed a way for Sukuna to remake his domain and didn't really think about what he would lose here. Or Yuji's domain. It was never even given a name. Or Hikari and Uraume. What happened there? Literally 99% of that fight was off screen. We barely know what happened in it. The whole fight just left me with more questions than I had when the fight started, which is not good for being the big final fight. But surely some of those questions will be answered in the ending, right? The 3 chapters of wrap-up, that will definitely be enough to fix the issues for me, right? Right? Well, no. If anything, I feel like I have even more questions from the ending. But before we get into those, I want to give my full, unadulterated opinion on the ending. Overall, I think the ending felt rushed, and that affected the overall quality. Are we seeing a theme here? Had this been a 4 to 5 chapter wrap-up instead of 3, I think it would have been way higher quality and way more clear what Gege was trying to do. I mean, even if we turn just that weird recap chapter into a chapter that delved more into the ending, I think that would have been more satisfying. Instead of Gege trying to justify to the fans why he did what he did. While there were some things I liked about the ending, I did have some pretty big issues with it as well. First and foremost is Megumi. I feel like such an important character coming back after all the trauma he endured like it never happened was a pretty lazy decision. Like he just laughed at a letter and that was basically it. We got no information on his feelings about what happened to Sumiki nor Gojo, who were both very important in his life. He just continues on as if nothing ever happened, just back to regular old Megumi. This is related to my other big issue with the ending, which is the general shift in tone. It feels like we just went back to season 1 vibes, as if everything that happened didn't happen. There's no remorse, no sense of mourning, just back to the status quo of silly. And I kinda hated that. This series spent so much time being depressing and dramatic that this tone shift feels so out of place and borderline bizarre, almost in a gross way. It doesn't feel like a lot of thought went into this decision, and to be honest, it doesn't feel like a ton of thought was put into the ending in general. And I think the most obvious example of this is the treatment of Gojo in the final chapter. Now, for the sake of transparency, I am somewhat of a Gojo fan, so I may be biased, but I feel like Gojo's saying, "Hasn't everyone had enough of Gojo Satoru?" is possibly the most out of character line in the entire series. It feels like Gege is trying to just get people to move on from him because of his own personal beliefs about the character. And to be honest, that just feels kind of immature. From the treatment of his character in 236 to now this, it feels like Gege is just letting his personal feelings get in the way of writing a satisfying conclusion for Gojo, which isn't really fair to his character or the many fans that enjoy him. I mean, even Mahito gets a better conclusion than Gojo, and he's been dead for like 100 chapters. This does bring me to the one part of this chapter that I did like, which was Sukuna's conclusion. Seeing a bit further into his reasoning for being the way he was quite interesting. I don't know how much I like the idea that it was all just revenge in his eyes rather than flexing, but I don't hate the idea either. Mostly, I think I'm just glad that we got more closure on him than what we got at the end of the fight. So yeah, overall, a pretty good aspect of the ending. Except, who is this? You can't just include some random new character we've never seen before in the final chapter of the manga. Is it Yozuru? Is it Kenjaku? Is it his mom? Like, hello? Gege really just put this in here and we're never gonna get any answers on it. As much as I do have my gripes with Jujutsu Kaisen, I don't think it would be fair to call the series bad as a whole. For all its faults and issues in the latter chapters, I think the overall piece of media is still of a decent quality. It was enjoyable in some capacity for the majority of its run, which is all a piece of media like Jujutsu Kaisen should be. But if there are 2 words that describe Jujutsu Kaisen perfectly, I think they would have to be missed potential. From the get-go, this series had a foundation set like few others. A wonderful world to be set in and interesting concepts that would take the series to interesting and new places. It truly had the potential to be a series that would be remembered fondly every step of the way, and I think that was squandered quite a bit. Instead of being a generation-defining series like it looked like it might be during Shibuya, it will instead be remembered as just another shonen. A very popular shonen, but a shonen nonetheless. Some of you might be wondering what the end of Jujutsu Kaisen means for me as a creator, and the answer is coming. Sometime next week, I'll be releasing a channel update video detailing what I'm going to do from here and what my next plans are. I still have a couple more Jujutsu Kaisen videos releasing in the coming weeks, but after that, you'll just have to wait and see. Thank you for watching as always, and I'll see you in a few days for our next video.